Principle 2 of Edgar Cayce's Creating Your Future by Mark Thurston and Christopher Fazel. Changing anything starts with motives and ideals. If you were to take a moment to imagine the kind of future that you hope to have, be specific. What types of people you want to have in your life, how you'll be spending your time, where you'll live and work. You may even wish to write down the images of what you see in store for you. Now, in order to turn that dream into a reality, some changes are necessary. Outer conditions may need to be modified, but you'll be required to alter some of your own thoughts and feelings as well. Exactly how does one go about making changes in one's life? Dozens of books and courses are available, each promising a secret method to help you make your life different: weight loss programs, stop smoking classes, subliminal tapes, to name a few. However, success does not lie in a gimmick with any particular technique. Change begins with your values, motives, and ideals. In 1942, Margaret, a 42-year-old woman who was working as a clerk, wrote to Edgar Cayce and asked for a reading. The 13th she had received from him, her series of readings, had begun 10 years earlier with information on her anemia, but she also suffered from anxiety and depression. Through the years, she had struggled to improve her physical and emotional health, yet she had a great deal of trouble effectively taking charge of her life. Now she again asked for advice regarding her health, home, life, work, general welfare, reminding her that the mind is the builder. The reading told her that she needed to build on spiritual ideals if she wanted to make a more positive future. Her mind could just as easily destroy her if it was built on selfish desires and interests. To emphasize the necessity of having a spiritual ideal, Cayce boldly affirmed that the most important experience of any individual in any lifetime is to establish a spiritual ideal. The message couldn't be stated any more plainly, and it's directed to every single one of us. Before anything can change for the better, before your mind can truly create a brighter future, you need to establish the right purposes. Let's expand on the metaphor that likens the mind to a carpenter who creates new buildings. Who is the architect in this analogy, who draws the blueprints and establishes a pattern for the mind to follow in its creativity? The answer: your motives, ideals, and values. What are your personal values? What do you hold as an ideal? Many individuals have difficulty even in understanding these questions. Why? Because most people let their unconscious motives and values drive their thinking and their feeling. These ideals lie hidden like the gears of a clock that mysteriously make the hands turn. For most of us, beliefs and values are so embedded in the cultural atmosphere that we don't even recognize or see them. It's like trying to observe the air we breathe. The fifth dimension. Both Cayce and Jung describe the mental realm, the realm of ideas, as the fourth dimension, a domain extending beyond the limits of time and space. The three-dimensional reality of material life is a depiction of the four-dimensional thought form world. However, if ideas give rise to physical things, what's the source of these fourth-dimensional ideas? It makes sense to imagine a fifth dimension. That would be the origin of any thought. Such a level of reality in the invisible realms of the soul is where values and motives live. Any attitude or thought becomes an expression of some ideal, conscious or unconscious. There are no value-free ideas because every idea has an implicit ideal behind it. Although ideals reside in higher dimensions than thought, they may not necessarily be attuned to the spirit of the Creator. So, for example, selfish motives give rise to selfish thoughts. Although many of our values are products of our families and societies, and sometimes these sources are not very spiritually enlightened, for years psychologists and philosophers have attempted to map this remote terrain of the fifth dimension. So from the psychoanalytic work with patients, Sigmund Freud concluded that all our values are ultimately rooted in primitive biological drives. Carl Jung, by contrast, asserted that while physical desires shape many of our values, there is nevertheless a spiritual element that can raise us above the more carnal concerns. The noted mythologist Joseph Campbell grouped human motives into four categories: the drive to eat, drive to procreate, impulse to conquer, and finally, compassion. The first two are clearly animal drives, while the third is distinctly human, and the fourth constitutes an awakening of spiritual awareness. The philosophy of the Cayce readings takes a bold stand. Although allowing for carnal or earthy desires, the readings insist that our true nature is spiritual and that our original values or ideals are the same as God's. And these are the same ideals that have been exemplified by the great spiritual teachers throughout history: love, patience, forgiveness, kindness, and compassion. Ideals versus ideas. Ideals are not the same as ideas, although it's easy to confuse them. Religion can be a rich source of spiritual ideals, but when zealots force their religion onto others with a "you must believe" attitude, they confuse their religion's ideals with human ideas. One way of understanding the difference between the two is think of ideas, thoughts for example, as things. This notion is useful because you can own material things, and your ideas are kind of possession. When you persuade others to accept them, you increase the value of your ideas. The more that you persuade others to agree with your ideas, the more power or security that you derive from them. So to convert, becomes the motto of every religious zealot. You can't own a word or opine the contrary. For an ideal to become effective in words, you must allow it to own you. So, for example, you can have the spirit of a strong idea, for example, with Jesus, and work hard to push them onto others. But until you allow forgiveness and tolerance to influence your thoughts, feelings, and actions directly, you have not accepted this ideal. By forgiving yourself to an ideal or value, you allow it to change you. So what's your motive? Two men were approached and asked to contribute to a worthwhile building project that was intended to provide shelter for the homeless. One man was wealthy, gave $1,000, and was looking to make this a tax write-off when he learned that his last name was going to be listed on a paper as a major donor. He was quick to contribute. The other man was of modest means, gave what he could, much less than $1,000, because he had seen the suffering of the homeless and empathized with their pain. These two men had the same idea: to give money. They performed identical acts of service, however, their motives were entirely different. No doubt, ideas and acts of kindness are important to building a happy future, but the motivations that spur those actions are just as important. The mind creates with the stuff of values and motives. Our ideals are the very substance, the building materials with which our attitudes and emotions construct our future. By analogy, architectural plans designate not only the shape and size of a new structure, but whether it is to be made of solid concrete or unstable clay. We can build an inner life based on greed or self-interest, or we can build with compassion and empathy. Why we do something is just as important as what we do. Conversely, people can share the same ideal and yet have quite different ideas about how to manifest it. Republicans and Democrats alike want peace and prosperity for the nation, but any political debate will demonstrate that they have very different ideas about how to achieve these goals. We can have strong disagreements with someone about how to manifest some value, and yet, again, still be on the same team, so to speak. So Cayce was surrounded by a team of bright followers, but quite often each of the members of the group had a different idea about how some task should be implemented. Cayce believed that it was all right to have a variety of ideas so long as they shared a common ideal. So how to connect with your spiritual ideal for positive change? Already at the center of your being lives a spiritual ideal. Whether you have ever been conscious of it or not, even though this core ideal is the same for everyone. Defining it is a very personal matter. The ideal is a state of consciousness that resonates to the very nature of God. Since each of us is a spark of the Creator, we share in that divine impulse or motive. We can't totally define this spiritual ideal. No word or phrase can articulate it completely, but we can choose personally meaningful words that identify our own particular version of it. Then, as we keep this ideal clearly in mind, it helps us to build positive changes in all areas of our lives. At least two useful methods can help you decide on a word or a phrase that describes this highest spiritual value. One is to think of people whom you deeply respect or revere. Major religious figures are certainly candidates, but other less famous role models may serve just as well. Ask yourself, what is it in them that awakens your admiration? What are their values and character traits that make them so special to you? The qualities that you list may be ones that you'll want to include in the wording for your spiritual ideal. Another way of finding words to describe your ideal is to think back to moments in your own history when you felt lifted up, elevated in some way. Your peak moments in life provide clues about your core spiritual ideal. Sometimes these extraordinary events may come during prayer, meditation, or dream experiences that give you a glimpse of a higher reality. Perhaps an inspiration occurred when you were out in nature or during a moment of special tenderness. Maybe a peak experience happened when you acted with loving selflessness. As you resurrect these special moments from your past, feel their impact on you. Then let those feelings crystallize into a word or a phrase that best captures this inner experience. The words that you write down will describe your best understanding of the spiritual ideal. Setting mental or physical ideals. The personal word you choose for the universal spiritual ideal is a kind of symbol. And like any symbol, it means more than you can grasp consciously. It manifests just as a small part of itself while reaching into the deeper levels of your mind. The way an iceberg submerged into the ocean reveals only its tip, but it's the hidden part that has the power to shape your thoughts and actions. How can you tell if the symbolic words you've chosen for your spiritual ideal really correspond to the essential core of your soul? What Casey called your individuality, which is the essential core of your soul. Confirmation comes from the attitudes, emotions, and actions it draws out of you. These thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are your mental and physical ideals. The following story illustrates the process. A boy going to high school in the mid-1960s found a symbol for the spiritual ideal in the guise of the contemporary folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. His first experience with this symbol was purely at a feeling level. All he knew was that their music held a strange and powerful magnetism for him, and it stirred things within him. He couldn't express, but could only feel deeply. Later, he heard words and phrases in their songs that helped him articulate more clearly the powerful impact this group had had on him. He heard lyrics about justice, ringing in the bells of freedom, and loving one another as if we were all his brothers and sisters. The words harmonious, loving justice became another way for him to describe symbolically the core values within his own soul. The words combined with the deep feelings inspired by the music and began to shape the boy's ethics. He grew to appreciate the values of fairness, equality, compassion, hope, courage. These attitudes and emotions became his mental goals, specific ways in which spiritual ideals came to his mental world. So in turn, these values helped shape his activities. They inspired him to study the artistic, guitar, and musical harmonies. Those ideals continued to direct him throughout his adult years when his actions began authentically to reflect his mental ideas. They became physical ideals. Even when he couldn't manifest his ideals perfectly, he would try to act in ways that at least approached them. By speaking fairly, looking for the common humanity in each person, and telling the truth as he understood it. Most of all, he strove to generate harmony and equality in all of his relationships. The application of his physical ideals never made him rich, but he never did become a famous folk singer. Nevertheless, he found strength in feeling that he was a part of the same great work that had inspired the three singers who first symbolized his spiritual ideal. Putting ideals to the test. What happens when a person tries to change his or her personal patterns by applying new motives and ideals? 85 people familiar with the Casey readings attempted to do just that during a 3-week research project. As volunteers, they agreed to follow certain steps at home. The experiment was designed to test over time the effectiveness of thinking consciously about and recommitting to values and ideals. All 85 people completed workbook exercises to identify problem areas in their lives. Difficult relationships and addictive behaviors were the most frequent examples. Then each participant shortened the list to one core problem, arrived at on the basis of a strong desire to make a change happen in this situation and a feeling that the time was right, that the circumstance was ripe for change. So you want to make clear statements of intention when you journal write. 3 weeks, writing out your intentions. Then you want to evaluate how successful those changes were, how successful you were in making those changes. So there was an experiment that I'm referring to that this group of people had attained. They found problems that were deep-seated and would probably require months of effort before positive results could be achieved. However, one of the most interesting findings was measured by a multiple-choice questionnaire completed just prior to and after the 3-week experimental period. Developed by psychologist J.B. Rotter, the questionnaire evaluates the so-called locus of control. That is, the extent to which a person believes that the forces shape and control his or her life, either external or internal. Over the 3 weeks, the group demonstrated a highly significant change on the test scores. Their feelings and perceptions had shifted to reflect a growing awareness that such life-shaping forces reside within oneself. The CAYCE readings indicate that working with values, motives, and ideals is fundamental to personal growth. In fact, it's considered the most effective entry point in the sequence of steps that leads to change. However, there are no shortcuts to creating a positive future. Paying careful attention to ideals puts you in touch with an invaluable resource, the power that resides in your soul, to take charge of your life. Here's an exercise. The focus of this exercise is on setting reachable short-term behavior, goals, physical ideals in other words, for shaping a positive future. First, spend some time deciding on your personal expression of a spiritual ideal. That means a central value that gives your life meaning. Then you want to pick one area of your life that you want to change for the better. Decide on some mental ideals, for example, optimal thoughts and feelings, physical ideals, positive activities that may apply. And for example, that area might be your diet, a relationship, or a career situation. And as you make a short list of these physical ideals related to one particular part of your idea, a mental ideal may suggest a good career, an ideal attitude. Whatever this ideal behavior that you've selected, you want to choose behavior goals that are reachable. So in other words, give yourself room to be successful during the coming week, and later you'll want to commit to more challenging physical ideals in the particular life circumstance. But start out first with small steps that are attainable. And remember, give yourself room to be successful. End of Principle 2. Moving on to the next video for Principle 3, God is living, active, and responsive.